Some of the wealthiest institutions in pre-modern Asia were built by men who owned nothing. They shaved their heads, renounced personal property, and pledged detachment from worldly desire. Yet over centuries, the monasteries they inhabited accumulated vast estates, controlled agricultural production, influenced rulers, and in some cases, rivaled the state itself in economic power. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks at first glance. The idea sounds like a contradiction. Buddhism, founded in the 5th century BCE by Siddhartha Gautama in northern India, centers on renunciation. The Buddha taught that attachment to desire, especially attachment to material wealth, is a root cause of suffering. The ideal monastic life was simple, disciplined, stripped of personal possessions. Early monks owned little more than robes and begging bowls. They depended on alms, they wandered, they detached. And yet, over the centuries, Buddhist monasteries across Asia accumulated land, wealth, political influence, and in some cases, military power. Entire regions saw monastic estates become economic engines. In Tang Dynasty China, monasteries controlled vast tracts of farmland. In medieval Japan, some temples fielded armed forces. In Tibet, monastic institutions governed territories. This was not a minor side effect, it was structural. So how does a philosophy of detachment produce institutions of accumulation? The answer is not hypocrisy, it's incentives. To understand how this happened, we need to begin with what Buddhism actually created, not just a set of teachings, but an organized community known as the Sangha. From its earliest days, Buddhism was not simply a personal meditation practice. It was institutional. Monks and nuns lived in communities. They followed rules. They preserved texts. They educated lay followers. They required shelter. In India, early monasteries, known as viharas, were often supported by merchants and rulers. Wealthy patrons donated land or built structures as acts of merit. In Buddhist doctrine, generosity toward the Sangha generated spiritual benefit. Supporting monks was not merely charity, it was an investment in karmic credit. That mechanism matters because once spiritual merit becomes linked to material donation, an economic channel opens. When Buddhism spread beyond India into Central Asia and eventually into China, around the 1st century CE, it entered far larger political systems. China, in particular, offered fertile ground for institutional expansion. The Chinese imperial state was bureaucratic, hierarchical, and deeply concerned with legitimacy. Emperors did not rule by force alone. They ruled under the mandate of heaven. Moral authority was central to political stability. Buddhism offered something powerful to rulers, spiritual reinforcement. By supporting monasteries, emperors could signal virtue, benevolence, and cosmopolitan sophistication. Patronage strengthened their moral image. In return, monasteries prayed for the state, preserved texts, educated elites, and acted as stabilizing cultural institutions. Land donations began to flow. During the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 CE, Buddhism reached its institutional height. This was a period of relative prosperity and cultural flourishing. It was also a period in which monasteries expanded rapidly. Wealthy families donated estates, officials endowed temples, and the imperial court itself granted land and tax privileges. And here is where the economic shift becomes visible. Individual monks still renounced personal property. They did not accumulate wealth for themselves. But monasteries as collective entities could own land. They could operate farms. They could receive rents. They could manage granaries. They could store surplus. Over time, those privileges compounded. Tax exemption played a crucial role. In many cases, land owned by monasteries was exempt from certain state taxes or labor obligations. In a pre-modern agrarian economy, tax burdens were significant. If two estates produce equal harvests, but one is tax exempt, its surplus grows faster. Surplus translates into reinvestment. Reinvestment translates into expansion. Monasteries became landlords. They leased land to tenant farmers, they collected rents in grain or coin, and they provided storage facilities that could smooth famine cycles. In unstable times when political dynasties rose and fell, monasteries often endured. Their religious role insulated them from some of the volatility that plagued secular elites. Stability attracts capital. If you are a landholder in an uncertain era, you may prefer to donate property to a monastery that can protect and manage it. If you are a merchant, you may deposit surplus goods in temple granaries. If you are a local official seeking influence, you align yourself with an institution respected by the population. This is how spiritual authority begins converting into economic authority. The key point is structural. Monasteries were trusted institutions embedded within political systems. They were long-lived, they were tax-advantaged, they were culturally protected. In economic terms, they possessed durability and credibility, two of the most powerful drivers of capital accumulation. Wealth followed trust, and because monks themselves lived modestly, the wealth did not manifest as visible extravagance at the individual level. It accumulated at the institutional level. Fields expanded, temple complexes grew, libraries multiplied, donations reinforced endowments. By the mid-Tang period, Buddhist monasteries in China controlled enormous estates. Exact figures are debated, but historical records suggest that by the 8th and 9th centuries, monasteries owned significant percentages of cultivable land in certain regions. They were not marginal actors, they were economic centers. This had ripple effects. When land transfers to monasteries, it exits the taxable base of the state. Over time, this can strain imperial finances. Governments rely on land taxes to fund armies, infrastructure, and bureaucracy. If too much productive land becomes exempt, fiscal pressure builds. Meanwhile, monasteries were not passive landlords. They operated workshops, they engaged in lending, and they served as custodians of wealth. In an era before modern banking, temples provided a form of financial intermediation. People entrusted them with valuables for safekeeping. Endowments were structured to support perpetual religious services. Longevity plus trust equals compounding. This pattern was not unique to China, but China demonstrates it clearly. The scale of the Tang Empire magnified the effect. When an institution grows inside a vast agrarian system and accumulates land over generations, it becomes economically formidable. And yet, at the core of Buddhism remained the teaching of impermanence, the reminder that all material conditions are transient. There is irony here, but not contradiction. The monks were not hoarding for personal pleasure. The institution was expanding because the surrounding society rewarded it. Rulers sought legitimacy, elites sought merit, commoners sought protection and spiritual reassurance. The monastery sat at the center of that exchange. This is where Western audiences often misinterpret the story. It is tempting to frame this as moral drift, as though monks abandoned detachment, but the more accurate interpretation is institutional evolution. Once an organization gains protection and endowment, it must manage resources, it must sustain buildings, it must feed residents, it must maintain ritual obligations. Infrastructure requires income, income requires land, land requires administration, administration requires power, and slowly the monastery becomes more than a spiritual retreat. It becomes an economic node within the imperial system. In some regions, this growth remained balanced. In others, it created tension. But before we reach backlash and political confrontation, it is important to understand that the accumulation was not accidental. It followed incentives embedded in both religious doctrine and statecraft. Merit-based giving incentivized donation. Imperial patronage incentivized expansion. Tax exemption incentivized compounding. Cultural reverence incentivized protection. Put those together over centuries and you do not get poverty. You get wealth concentration. By the early 9th century, the economic footprint of Buddhist monasteries in China was substantial enough that it began to alter the balance between sacred and secular power. Fields that once supported imperial tax revenue now supported temple estates. Labor that once served state projects now served religious communities. The institution had become durable, and durability is the most underappreciated force in economic history. When something survives across generations, it accumulates advantages that transient actors cannot match. Monasteries did not face quarterly performance reviews. They did not seek short-term gains. They were built to endure across lifetimes. That time horizon is transformative. If you want to understand how wealth forms in history, whether in religious institutions, universities, foundations, or sovereign funds, look at three things: legitimacy, tax treatment, and time. Buddhist monasteries in Tang, China had all three. And that combination turned a philosophy of detachment into one of the most powerful economic forces in pre-modern Asia. But once an institution grows wealthy inside a political system, a new question emerges. Who ultimately controls the land? The state or the sacred? That tension would not remain theoretical. When an institution accumulates wealth quietly, patiently, and under the protection of moral legitimacy, it rarely feels dangerous at first. It feels stabilizing, it feels virtuous, it feels untouchable, until the balance shifts. By the mid-9th century, during the Tang Dynasty, the scale of Buddhist institutional wealth in China had become impossible to ignore. Monasteries owned vast estates. Tens of thousands of monks and nuns were exempt from taxation and military service. Temple lands produced grain that did not flow into imperial coffers. Donations continued, endowments expanded. The Sangha was no longer a peripheral spiritual network. It was a parallel economic structure embedded within the empire, and empires do not tolerate parallel structures indefinitely. In 845 CE, Emperor Wuzong launched what became known as the Great Anti-Buddhist Persecution. Officially, the campaign was framed in ideological terms. Buddhism was criticized as foreign, excessive, and economically burdensome. But beneath the rhetoric lay fiscal urgency. The Tang state was under financial strain. Military campaigns had drained resources. Tax revenues were pressured. From the perspective of the imperial court, Religious landholdings represented frozen capital, productive acreage shielded from state extraction. The solution was blunt. Thousands of monasteries were destroyed. Historical records suggest that over 4,600 temples were dismantled and more than 40,000 smaller shrines eliminated. Around 260,000 monks and nuns were forced to return to lay life. Monastic lands were confiscated and reabsorbed into the taxable base of the empire. This was not a minor correction. It was a structural reset. The state reclaimed land, it reclaimed labor, it reasserted supremacy over an institution that had grown too economically independent. And here is the pattern. When moral authority accumulates wealth under political protection, it can thrive. When fiscal pressure rises and that wealth competes with state power, tolerance shrinks. This dynamic was not confined to China. In Japan, Buddhism arrived in the 6th century and gradually intertwined with the imperial court. By the Heian period, 794-1185, major monasteries, such as Enryaku-ji near Kyoto, had amassed significant estates. Like their Chinese counterparts, Japanese temples benefited from land donations and tax privileges. Over generations, these holdings expanded. But in Japan, the story took a sharper turn. Some monasteries developed armed forces. These so-called sohei, or warrior monks, were not mythical figures. They were organized armed groups that protected temple interests and at times intervened in political disputes. Religious institutions had evolved into semi-military actors. Spiritual legitimacy had fused with land control and coercive capability. When sacred institutions can mobilize force, they cease to be merely symbolic. They become power brokers. Throughout the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, monastic complexes in Japan influenced succession disputes, regional governance, and economic flows. They were landlords, they were lenders, they were educators, they were political actors. The pattern repeated. Legitimacy attracted donation. Donation created landholding. Landholding created autonomy. Autonomy invited confrontation. In Tibet, the fusion was even more explicit. Over centuries, Buddhist monasteries evolved into the backbone of governance. Large estates were controlled by monastic elites. Theocratic structures emerged. Political authority and spiritual authority became inseparable. This is not an indictment of belief. It is a lesson in institutional mechanics. Wherever trust concentrates, capital follows. Wherever capital concentrates, power consolidates. And when power consolidates outside direct state control, tension becomes inevitable. The deeper insight is that monasteries did not pursue wealth in the modern corporate sense. They accumulated it because systems rewarded them for being stable, morally authoritative, and tax-advantaged. They became repositories of trust in volatile environments. In agrarian economies vulnerable to famine, invasion, and dynastic turnover, monasteries offered continuity. Continuity compounds. Imagine two institutions in the 8th century. One is a regional noble house dependent on political favor. The other is a monastery protected by religious reverence. When political tides shift, noble houses fall. Monasteries often survive. Survival allows landholdings to persist across generations. With each generation, endowments grow. Time is the most powerful financial instrument in history. But time does not eliminate politics. The Tang persecution demonstrated that states will reclaim resources when institutional wealth challenges fiscal capacity. In Japan, the eventual unification efforts under leaders like Oda Nobunaga in the 16th century targeted powerful monasteries. And Ryakuji itself was attacked and burned in 1571 as part of broader centralization efforts. Once again, economic and military autonomy within religious institutions was perceived as a threat. The lesson is consistent. Sacred institutions can accumulate wealth under protection. They cannot remain indefinitely independent of state power if their economic footprint becomes too large. Now, step back from Asia and consider the broader pattern. Medieval Europe saw similar dynamics with the Catholic Church, which became one of the largest landowners on the continent. Monasteries, bishoprics, and abbeys held estates, collected rents, and operated under special privileges. At times, they rivaled kings in influence. Modern parallels exist as well. Religious institutions in the United States operate under tax-exempt status while managing investment portfolios that rival major corporations. In recent years, disclosures revealed that the investment arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had accumulated assets exceeding $100 billion. Capital built steadily over decades through contributions and long-term investment management. Universities oversee endowments larger than some sovereign funds. Nonprofit foundations compound wealth across generations. Sovereign wealth funds operate with state protection and multi-decade mandates. Central banks manage balance sheets measured in trillions under legal independence. The pattern is consistent. When institutions combine legitimacy, tax advantage, and time, capital accumulates quietly and power follows. This is not mystical. It is arithmetic. Remove taxation, extend the time horizon, add continuous inflows, limit competition. The compounding effect is immense. Buddhist monasteries across Asia were early examples of this structural advantage. Their wealth was not built through conquest alone. It was built through donation, protection, and durability. But here is where the story matters for modern financial education. We often assume wealth flows toward innovation or productivity. Sometimes it does, but often it flows toward institutional protection. If you want to understand the architecture of real wealth in any financial system, study where tax exemptions exist. Study where legitimacy shields assets. Study which institutions outlive political cycles. Those are the compounding centers. This does not mean monasteries were cynical operators. It means that when belief systems intersect with political power, economic consequences follow. The contradiction at the heart of this story, renunciation generating accumulation, is not hypocrisy, it is structural feedback. Lay people gave land seeking merit. Rulers granted privileges seeking legitimacy. Monasteries reinvested surplus seeking stability. Over centuries, those feedback loops built vast institutional wealth, and then states recalibrated when the balance tipped. Money and power rarely coexist peacefully. They negotiate constantly. So what does this mean for us? It means that wealth is not only created by markets, it is shaped by incentives embedded in political and cultural systems. It means that institutions we perceive as moral, educational, or charitable can also be economic giants, not because of malice, but because of structural advantage. And it means that when evaluating modern systems, we must look beyond surface narratives. Where is capital protected? Who is exempt? Which organizations are built to endure for centuries rather than quarters? Those questions matter more than trending assets. History does not repeat in costume, but it repeats in incentives. Buddhist monasteries built some of Asia's wealthiest institutions, not because monks abandoned detachment, but because society aligned wealth with virtue and shielded it with power. And whenever virtue, tax policy, and time align, compounding begins. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand how institutions accumulate power, you will misread the world around you. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.